So, fundamentals. So many professional traders, especially some of those coming out of banks and corporations, major funds, don't understand what I consider some of the core fundamentals. For example, a senior person at one of the world's largest mutual funds, and his name is actually big enough that if I said it, you'd probably recognize it. I gave a talk before his group, and he said, perhaps we should use trailing stops. I gave a talk similar to this for Dow Jones in Asia. I think it was 8 different major cities in Asia, from Jakarta to Beijing. There was usually about 300 traders in each room listening to my talk. Most of them work for banks. Most of them didn't know how much money they were trading, and they didn't know how much money they could lose before they lost their jobs. So you work for a bank, do you know how much money you're trading?
No.
And how much money you could lose before you lost your job?
I have a sense, yeah.
It's probably because you listened to some of this before. So basically, some people are taking our technical courses without some of these fundamentals. So I want to look at 3 areas, which is objectives, risk, and position sizing strategies. So let's look at objectives first. I think objectives is 50% of system development, and most people ignore it. I can remember once talking to somebody about his objectives, and I said, well, what are your objectives? And he had to think a long time, and he said, well, I'd like to buy my wife a car. I said, oh, okay. He said, by September, which was like 4 months away. And I said, well, what are we talking about in the car here? He said, oh, a regular American car that costs about $15,000. So it kind of dates us a little bit, but I'm going, okay. So you want to make $15,000 in 3 months. How much money do you have in your account? He said, oh, about $30,000. I'm going, okay, you want to make 50% in your account in 3 months. How much are you willing to lose in order to get there? I don't know. Nothing. I said, well, you might have some drawdowns on the way. How much are you willing to lose? He said, well, I said, how about you willing to give it all up, risk it all, at least have a slight chance of losing it all in order to make your 50%? No. You willing to lose 50%? No. Even a small chance of 50%? No. You willing to lose 25%? Well, no. I said, well, how about just like a 1% chance of a 25% loss? Well, maybe. So I go, you're willing to have like a 1% chance of a 25% loss, but you want to make 50% in 2 months. You know any systems that do that? No. And that's the way most people think about objectives. They basically ignore it, and if you prod them with enough questions, they have a rough idea. So how can you develop a system without knowing what you want? You can't. How can you develop a system that fits you without knowing what objectives fit you? And the bottom line is you can't. So another example is, what market type do you want your system to fit? We're going to have a whole talk on market type. Basically, there's 6 market types: up, down, and sideways under quiet and volatile conditions. And they're all different. So what market type do you want your system to fit? What time frame? What beliefs do you have that your system must fit, or you wouldn't trade it? And I know Ken Long developed one system because he basically took all his core beliefs, and he always wondered what you'd have to do to take the opposite side. So he looked at his core beliefs, and then he looked at the exact opposite of his core beliefs and turned that into a system which was actually one of his better ones.
Can you trade it?
Yeah, I think, I can't remember which one it is, but I think it's what?
Washout.
Washout. It's one of the systems in Swing. So what criteria must be met for you to be willing to trade it? That is a question about that we'll also get in tomorrow, which has to do with your strategies for what convinces you that the thing works. What sort of drawdowns are you willing to tolerate to trade the system? How much money do you need to make yearly for your system to be acceptable? You know, and how much tolerance do you have in those two criteria? So that's a little bit about objectives, not a lot. When we cover systems, we typically really emphasize objectives, but we're going to play a game here where you get to play and look at objectives. So now let's look at risk a little bit. Whenever you enter into a trade, you must have an exit to limit your risk. I call this R, and R basically stands for risk. For example, you might buy a stock at 50 and decide you should exit if it drops to 40, which is 20%. That is, if you invested 5,000, your risk would be 20% of that, or 1,000, and that would be your 1R value for that trade. That's your risk. One risk unit is $1,000 because of the definitions you put on it. So the golden rule of trading is to cut your losses short and let your profits run. So the bottom line is you want your risk to be 1R or less, and you want your profits to be much greater than 1R. So let's look at R multiples now. It's very, very useful to express your trading results as a multiple of your initial risk. So I call these R multiples. And let's look at examples now. So your initial risk is 1,000. You make $2,500. You have a 2.5R profit. 2,500 is 2.5 times what you were originally willing to risk, so you have a 2.5R profit. If your initial risk is $10 per share and you make $25 per share, you also have a $2.5 profit. One is expressed as total risk, one is expressed as unit risk. Let's say you buy a $50 stock with a $2 stop at 48. You invest $5,000 to buy 100 shares, but you're only risking $2 a share, so your risk is $200. You're not $5,000. So the stock goes up to 70, you've made $2,000. Your risk was only 200, so you made a profit of 10R. Your total investment was 5,000, your total risk was 200, and your R multiple was 10R because it was $2,000, which is 10 times your initial risk. So let's make sure you understand this. Your risk is 500, your gain is 7,500. What's your R multiple? 15. Your risk is 500, your gain is 400. What's your R multiple? 0.8. And this one, your risk is 500, 3R. And this is a little bit more normal. What you normally have to do, what is it? 3.56 R. You can also express your losses as a multiple of your initial risk. So your initial risk is 1,000, you lose 1,500. Maybe it gapped overnight or something. You have a 1.5 R loss. Or your initial risk is $10 a share, you lose $15 a share, so you have a 1.5 R loss. Again, it's the same. One is total risk, one is risk per share. So here are examples of R multiples with losses. So your risk is 500, you lose 100. What's your R multiple? Minus 0.2. 100, 500, your loss is 1,500. 3R minus 3R. Your loss is $5 a share, or your risk is $5 a share, you lose $3.50 a share. Minus 0.7. $8 a share, and your loss is 12. Okay? So you understand that. So remember the two key principles: cut losses short, let your profits run. Make sure your reward to risk ratio left in the trade is at least 1-to-1. This is another point. Again, this is somewhat all made up, but I remember a hedge fund trader in Germany who didn't want to come to one of my workshops, but he wanted me to come to him to teach him a few things. And he said his biggest problem was, he was really good at fundamentals. So he'd say, I want to buy, I think he said there was an example of the Brazilian real. And he said, this is the buy point. And I'll just make up some numbers, and we'll say it's 3 or something. And he said, I know it's not going to go below 2.8. Fundamentally, it's very strong. And he said, I would get in this thing, and I'd be right. My target's right here at 7. I'm going up here, and it gets to 6.8. And then he says, it goes all the way back down here, and I get stopped out. I'm kind of shaking my head thinking, what is this? Here he had 0.2 risk with a gain of 4, so a huge R multiple here. When he's here, if he doesn't change his stop, what's his risk? Almost probably something like 3.7 or something. And what's his gain? Let's say this is 6.5, so maybe 0.5. So he's now has a potential reward of 0.5 and a potential loss of 3.5. So a kind of a fundamental rule is one-to-one, at least in the remainder of the trade, have a reward to risk ratio of at least 1-to-1. And now, if you're absolutely certain that your target is here, what that means is as you're getting closer and closer to here, your stop gets tighter and tighter because it's just 1-to-1. It's one way of doing it. What if it happens to, you decide you'll give it some room to go, and you go up here, and it actually comes above here. You say, I'm going to give it a little room to go. Well, then you got to make up where it's going to go. And so my son would play this game, and he'd say, well, I think it's going to go to 7.2. So he's got a 0.2 gain, and he'd have a 0.2 potential risk. It's all made up in your head anyway. But at least if you keep track of it this way, it makes some sense and you've got some logic and probability on your mind, even if that's all made up as well. So you understand that? Make sure the reward to risk ratio left in the trade is at least 1-to-1. So now we get to position sizing strategies, or how much to trade. So a basic fundamental position sizing strategy is what I call CPR for traders, where R is the risk per unit, C is the total risk, cash or the total risk, P is position sizing. The formula is position sizing is equal to total risk divided by the unit risk. So here's an example. Your cash, your total risk is 100. Your unit risk is your total risk is 1,000. Your unit risk is 100. What's your position sizing? Good. Now your total risk is 100. Your unit risk is 10. What's your position size? Your total risk is 1,000. Your unit risk is 1. Your total risk is 2,000. Your unit risk is 25. 80.